In today's video, I am going to show you how I designed this cup holder for my sister's wheelchair using Silhouette Studio and Silhouette 3D, and I printed it on my Alta Plus 3D printer. In this part of the video, I'm just going to show a quick overview of the different shapes I'll be creating in Silhouette Studio to create the templates for the cup holder and its bracket that I will be using in the Silhouette 3D software. I'll include a timestamp for later in this video where I will go into more detail for this section in case you're interested in getting the full step-by-step details for this part. But to keep the main parts of this video as short as possible, the 2D portion of the process will be just a quick summary here. I'll be using circles and rectangles to create these shapes, and I'll size them according to the desired dimensions of the final cup holder. I'll use the different modify tools available in Silhouette Studio, such as weld and subtract all, and some of the shapes will need to be compound paths. These shapes represent the cross-sectional views of the different sections of the cup holder. The cup itself will have a base, a middle, and a top, and the bracket will have a base and a rod that will be attaching to the wheelchair's arm. Now we're in the Silhouette 3D software program, and we're going to open the file we just created in Silhouette Studio and select Extrusion. And I like to get a front view of my shapes. Now, for some reason, my shapes did not come in at the size that I wanted, so I'm going to make sure the aspect ratio is locked, and I'm going to set the width of the shape to 4 inches. So now I am going to make sure my aspect ratio is unlocked, and I want to set the total height of the group to 2 times the desired height of the cup plus the 0.3 inches that I'm going to want the base to be. So that means I'm resizing it to 10.8 because I want the cup to be 3.5 inches tall. Now I'm going to ungroup and resize that top shape to a height of 0.3 inches. Once again, making sure that aspect ratio is still unlocked. Now I want to group the top and the middle shapes together. So I'm going to right-click and group after I've selected both of them. Next, I'm going to resize the height of the bottom shape to 0.3 inches, once again making sure that our aspect ratio is unlocked. And now you'll notice that the top part is kind of floating up in the air. Now for those top 2 shapes, we want to resize the height of that to be the total height we want for the cup, which is 3.5 inches, plus we're going to add the 0.3 inches of the base back in, so that will make it a total of 3.8 inches. And after you've resized them, you want to level those shapes to the bed. Next, you want to ungroup all of the shapes. And now I'm going to zoom in so I can get a better look of things. Now I'm going to weld the bottom and the middle shapes together. So I'll select the bottom shape and the middle shape, and I will weld them. Next, I'm going to weld the top shape with the bottom shape. And the reason I'm getting this error message is because I've got to select the top shape first and then the bottom one, and then I can weld them together. So now what we started out with the 3 shapes together, now it's all just one shape. And so we've got our final design, And you may need to adjust the total height to the desired height if it isn't quite right. So I'm going to adjust from 3.8 to 3.5. And so here we've got our final cup. Then we're going to come over here to 3D print. Now I'm going to use a setting for this that is between draft and standard. And so I created a new profile called Draft Standard. And we'll look at the configuration of this one. These are the settings of the layers and infill, including what type of infill we're going to use. This is the settings of the supports and adhesion. Speed and extrusion. And filament and printer options. And then once we're all ready, we'll click print and start the 3D print. All right, now we are in the Silhouette 3D software, so we're going to open the project we just created, which is the wheelchair cup holder mounting bracket, and we will open it, and we're going to select extrusion. And I like to rotate it up so I can get a better view of what we're doing. The first thing we want to do is make sure that it came in at the dimensions that we created it. So we want this base plate to be 1.75 inches by 3 inches, which it is. So I'm going to ungroup it, and to be, what's even more important is that the circle is, these two circles are the dimensions that we had selected before. And so I am going to select them both, and I'm going to make them just a little bit smaller. So I am going to go 0.625 and 0.625, just to make sure that 0.63 is what we need. And I want to make sure that, let's do it 0.62, 0.62. Oops, 0.62, because I want to make sure that the rod is not going to be too thick to go in. So I would rather have it too small than too large. So the total length of the rod, these two are going to be made into the rod. The total length is 2.375. And so that means this bottom layer here that doesn't have the notch in it needs to be about 0.3 inches in height. And so I'm going to make sure that my aspect ratio is unchecked. And so I'm going to change that to 0.3. And then I'm going to select the top one and I am going to make that 2 inches. So now, when you see this, we probably want to make sure that this bottom layer, we'll maybe want that to be 0.25 inches high. And you can't really see it because the bottom layer now is kind of sticking down inside the base. And so I'm trying to select that bottom layer. For right now, this bottom layer, let's do 0.1 so we can see this bottom layer that doesn't have a notch. And so I want to make that 0.3 inches tall. And then I am going to, oops, that's not what I want to do. I want to make sure that I want to see, okay, I just want to make sure there's some part of this that doesn't have the notch in it. And both of those I want to be about 2.2 inches tall. So I'm going to make sure that both of those are 2.2 inches tall. Actually, I need to group them first, and then I'll make them 2.2 inches tall. Now I'll ungroup them. And so this bottom without the notch is about 0.32 inches. And this top portion is roughly 2 inches. And I'm going to select the two of these again. And this bottom layer, I am going to change to 0.25 inches thick. Now this is going to go a little bit into the base, and I want the total length above the base to be 2.3 inches. And so right now, the total thing is 2.2 inches, but the base itself is 0.25. So I'm going to want to add 0.25 inches to this. So I am going to want to change the height of this group to 2.45 inches. So now the length of this pipe or the cylinder coming out of the base is going to be 2.3 inches because the base itself is 0.25 inches. So this now is our base assembly, which will be ready to assemble. And I'm thinking maybe the base, instead of 0.25, I'm going to make that 0.2. And so the total height, so I'm going to reduce this height of this one to 2.4. And then I'm going to ungroup these. So this one is about 0.35, which is what we want. And so that means the part that has the slot in it is going to be about 2 inches, which is what we want. So now we're going to start welding everything together. So I'm going to take the bottom, we're going to work from the bottom up. So I'm going to select the bottom, and we need to ungroup this. Oh, it's already ungrouped. I need to select this one and the bottom one, and then I'm going to weld them. Then I'm going to select this welded one and the top one, and I am going to weld it. So now we've got everything welded together. So we've got our mounting bracket ready. So this is what will mount onto the back of the wheelchair cup holder. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I'm going to save that in my 3D files. So this is going to be the wheelchair cup holder bracket. And so now we are ready to print this out on our 3D printer. Okay, after I printed out this bracket, even though I printed it out with an infill of 70%, it still snapped right at this point, no matter, with very little pressure. I did manage to glue the two pieces back together again with super glue, but I want to see if I can make this stronger. So I'm going to select my shape. I'm going to change dimensions here to rotation, and I'm going to change the z-axis to 90. And that's going to put it on its side. Now you notice when we did that, half of it is now underneath the platform level. And so what I'm going to do is I am going to level to bed. And so that will jump it back up to the platform level, and then I'm going to center it on the print bed. Okay, now we're going to do the bracket. So we're going to come to File and Open. I'm going to load the wheelchair bracket, and we're going to come to 3D Print. This is the computer that I actually have connected to my Alta Plus 3D printer. And the profile we're going to use is standard PLA. But we're going to make some changes to this. So I'm going to click on the gear icon. For the layers and infill, we're going to increase our infill density to 50%. And we're also going to change how the infill is put in. So we're going to change it to this one right here. And so these are all the different settings for the layers and infill panel that we're going to do. Supports and adhesion is just no supports. Speed and extrusion are all just the default values for the standard PLA. And filament and printer options are all just the standard default for the standard PLA profile. And then I have already saved this as another profile. And so I called it standard with infill density of 50. And you'll notice it's got the same changes that I made to the standard. I've changed it to this infill type and the infill density of 50%. Everything else is the same settings as for the standard PLA profile. Okay, and for the bracket that I'm going to print on its side like this, I am going to use supported PLA, but I am going to add a brim to the bottom because I tried to print this out with just a skirt and it failed when it got to about this point right there. And so the different settings for this particular one, this is the layers and infill settings, the supports and adhesion settings, speed and extrusion settings, and filament and printer options. And it looks like it's now working on the final portions. And it is finished. And so now I'll just take this out. And I'll use the spatula tool to remove this from the base. And it should just break off from the supports on the bottom. And unfortunately, the way this was made, it kind of left a ridge right there, which I think may interfere. But let's see if it made it stronger. Yeah, it is definitely stronger. And so it will be interesting to see if this little ridge right here is going to interfere with the wheelchair. I may have to file this down. And in fact, I think I'll just do that. Just take my file and just I may also reprint this with it on the base like this so that it prints this and then prints this coming up and see if it's as strong. This is strong. It doesn't seem to be wanting to snap off. Alright, these are the two ways that I had tried printing out the bracket here. The white one I printed out with using Silhouette filament, and this is the one that snapped off, and this is the one that I printed from the bottom up. This is using Ender PLA that I got off of Amazon, and I printed this from the side. And for this one, using the same settings that I did for this one made a very rough edge where the supports met this as it was being printed out, but it is very strong. It's not going to snap. This one I glued back together with super glue, and that seems to make it very strong. And so I'm really not sure if printing on the side actually did make this bond down here stronger, or if it's just the difference in the different filaments that I used. In either case, I think super glue will be just fine if it does snap off. And I actually prefer this one over this one because I don't like how rough this edge is. I have read that you can strengthen your 3D printed pieces by annealing them in the oven. So I'm going to put them in the oven here, and I am going to heat them to 145 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes. This particular oven has a reheat setting that I can get the temperature down that low. And then I'm just going to turn it on and heat it for 30 minutes. And then when that 30 minutes is up, I'm going to turn off the oven and let it cool down to room temperature without removing the 3D printed pieces first. I want them to cool down gradually. Okay, and for the bracket, I had originally planned to just drill holes and mount it with some screws, but since I was able to get a pretty good hold with super glue on this, I thought I would try putting the super glue onto this and see if we can get it mounted. So I'm just going to put the super glue on the back of this. Then I'm going to position it where I want it on here. Just kind of hold it in place. And I'll just put a rubber band around it to kind of hold it in place until it dries. And I'd say that looks pretty good. And so we'll see how that does. And this is the glue that I'm using. All right, within Silhouette Studio, I am going to create a circle. I'm going to lock the aspect ratio and make it a size of 4.2 inches. Next, I'm going to create a rectangle. And I'm just kind of eyeballing it to see what size I want it to be. This is going to make the part at the back of the cup that is going to hold the bracket that you are actually going to connect to the arm of the wheelchair. Now I'm going to duplicate it. That original rectangle is 2.041 by 0.777 inches. So that's the size that I have decided on. Okay, and now I'm going to want to have a wall thickness along that of roughly 0.4 inches. So I'm going to make this duplicate rectangle a width of 1.641, and I forgot to unlock the aspect ratio, so 1.641, and a height of 0.377 inches. And then I'm going to select both, and I am going to center it. Okay, I'm moving it out of the way, and I'm selecting divide, and then I'm going to click and drag the middle one out, and then I can just delete it. And then what I've got left, I'm going to line up with that circle where I'm going to resize it just kind of playing around with the size, and I want the corners of that inside rectangle to meet the circle. All right, next I'm going to select all the shapes and I'm going to weld them together. And I'm going to change the color of this to red just to kind of differentiate the different shapes I'm working with. So we've now created what will be the base of the cup. So I'm going to duplicate this, and now I'm going to create another circle. And this one I'm going to make sure the aspect ratio is locked, and I'm going to make this 3.8 inches. Then I'm going to overlay it. I'm bringing it to the front so I can see. I'm going to change the color of it to green because this is going to be another layer. So now I'm centering it as well as I can on that bottom layer. And then I'm going to center it here, and then I will just select the green circle and kind of nudge it down with my down arrow key on my keyboard until it looks like it's about centered. Now I'm going to select both shapes and I am going to divide. And then I'm going to remove that middle green arrow. And I'm going to duplicate it. Okay, and now I'm going to give the 3 different layers a different color, just so I can differentiate between the different shapes that are going to go with each layer. Now I'm going to create another circle, and I am going to size it 0.75 inches. And then I'm going to center that. And nudge it down a little bit so it's kind of in the center of that small arrow. Now I'm going to select everything. I'm going to divide it. And then I can delete those little pieces there. Now I'm going to create another circle and make it 0.75 inches. And I'm going to duplicate that 4 times, or actually 3 times. And then I'm going to kind of equal distance them along the rest of that circle. Okay, I'm going to select those 2 top circles. I want to make sure they're even. So I'm going to align them along the bottom, and then I'm going to repeat the same for these 2 bottom ones. And that makes sure that they're equally distanced. And then I'm going to just kind of nudge them over so that they are in the center of that little circle. And once I'm satisfied, select all of them and divide. Now you'll notice these pieces are separated now. I don't want that. So I'm just going to select the blue ones by holding down my Shift key and then clicking on them. And then I'm going to weld them together. And now they will move as one piece, and then I can delete these. And then I noticed the top one wasn't working, so I'm going to undo. I'm going to select them all, making sure I don't select the green one by mistake. Select them all, and I'm going to make it into a compound path. And so now they are all together. And I'm going to select those 2, and I'm going to center them. Okay, now I'm going to take the bottom red piece, which is going to be the base, and I'm going to align them all together. And then I'm going to zoom in because I want to make sure the alignment is perfect. And so you'll notice the green one is sticking out just a teeny tiny bit, so I'm going to select it and use the arrows on my keypad to put them in place. Okay, and now I'm going to create another rectangle. And I'm sorry at this point I forgot to minimize my screen recorder, but I'm positioning this rectangle because I'm going to want to cut out a slice out of the circle that is coming down to the bottom and meets where you just barely start to see the red circle. So I'm going to want to cut a slice out of that. So I'm zooming in again, and I want to line it up with that line there. And then the same with the other side. I'm going to resize it so that it lines up perfectly with that blue edge that's coming down. And I'm trying to be exact here. And so I'll resize it and drag it in to make sure that's exactly on the blue. And I'm nudging the different shapes again to make sure they're aligned together. And then I'm putting that corner right where the blue and the red meet. And so I'm just trying to make this rectangle perfectly spaced. And I'm coming down to the bottom to make sure everything is aligned on the bottom too, and I'm satisfied with how it's looking. So I'm going to zoom in so I can see the whole shape. Now what I should have done was make that rectangle a little bit taller so that it covered the entire loop of that outline, but I am going to duplicate this rectangle now as it's sized a couple of times. And then I'm going to carefully position it on the different layers, positioning it like it was where the bottom corners meets the bottom of the shape, and the sides exactly line up with that. And then I'm going to select them both, and I'm going to subtract all. And this is where I was saying I should have sized those rectangles a little higher to get rid of that other one, that little loop that's up above. So I just kind of resized it to include that one because I want to get rid of it. Select them both, and I'll subtract all again. And that got rid of the whole thing. That would have saved me some time if I had just made the rectangle tall enough to cover that. Now I'm going to repeat the process with this green layer. I'm going to make sure the bottom corners of that rectangle are lined up with that intersection. So I'm going to just use my arrow keys on the keypad to just kind of nudge it into position so that bottom corners are matching up with the curve. This time I was smart enough to resize it to include that loop. And so subtract them both and subtract all. And then we'll finally do it with the bringing that one. This is going to be the top layer, so I'm just bringing it to the front. Now I want to trim off that back for the bottom layer. So once again, I'm going to zoom in. And I'm going to change the color of the rectangle. Well, I'm going to actually change the color of the bottom layer to gray so that I can better see Now this one doesn't have the outline like the other ones did. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag one of these other ones over so I can get an idea of how far to bring that rectangle down so I know where to trim it. And so I'm going to use my arrow keys to nudge them over each other. And so now I can adjust the bottom so that it is right at that intersection of where the loops come together. And so I know this is where I need to subtract. So I'm going to fine tune to make sure that it's in the perfect position before I do my subtract. And I decided to just do it down there at the bottom. I don't know why, but and so now I'm just putting them all in order. And so I'm going to align everything up as good as I can. So the gray part is going to be the base of the cup. So I'm zooming in to make sure that everything is as aligned as perfectly as possible. So I'm using my arrow keys once again to nudge things back and forth and checking top and bottom to make sure. Okay, now I'm going to drag the middle gray portion out of the way, and I'm going to create a little drain hole. So I'm going to create a circle, and I am going to make it 0.375 inches. And I'm going to select the two of them, and I'm going to center them. I'm going to move the other things out of the way. Now it's not quite in the center. I want it in the center of the actual cup, and the little jog in the back of the base is throwing it off. So I'm kind of eyeballing it until it gets into the position that I want it to be. Then I'm going to select them both, and I'm going to subtract all. And then I'm going to click that center portion. I'm going to make a compound path. Then I'm going to realign everything up. So I'm going to get it as close as possible by using the Align tool, and then I'm going to zoom in again and make sure everything is perfectly aligned. So the blue layer needs to be nudged up a little bit. So once again, I'm using my keypad to just kind of nudge it into place. And I'm sorry, my screen recorder, I forgot to minimize that, so it's kind of in the way. Now I minimized it. I finally realized it was open. Now I'm going to select everything. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to group it. And then we are going to save to the hard drive. And after I saved it to the hard drive, I realized that I forgot to make the blue shape a compound path. So I'm back in here making that a compound path, realigning everything back up to make sure they are perfectly aligned, and then I will resave it to my hard drive. Okay, now we're going to create a bracket for the cup holder to go onto the wheelchair. So we're going to start by creating the base of the bracket. So I'm going to make a rectangle. I'm going to make sure the aspect ratio is unlocked. And I want the width to be 1.75 inches, and I want the height to be 3 inches. And then I'm going to change the color and move this out of the way. Now we are going to create the rod, the shape that's going to become the rod that is going to go into the arm of the wheelchair. So we're going to create a circle. I'm going to hold down the Shift key so I can make a circle. I'm going to make sure my aspect ratio is locked. And I am going to make a circle for the rod that's 0.625 inches. And I will change the color of this to red. And then I'm going to right click and I'm going to duplicate it. And I am going to make this one blue. Now the rod for the wheelchair has a little slot in it. And so I'm going to create another rectangle. I'm going to make sure my aspect ratio is unlocked. And this is going to be a width of 0.1875 by 0.07 inches high. And so I am going to zoom in here. And I am going to move this cut up. And just temporarily, I'm going to change the color of this so I can see a little better what I'm doing. And so I'm going to position this. Let's zoom in again. I am going to position this so that the top corner of the rectangle is perfectly placed, just like that. And then I am going to resize this up a little bit like this. And so I'm going to select them both, and I'm going to subtract all. So what this has done is put the little notch in the circle that we are going to need. So we'll come back out to the full view again. Now I'm going to want to position the rod about an inch down from the top of the bracket. So I'm going to create another placeholder rectangle that I'm going to make about 1 inch square. Oops. If I can get that shaped right, I want the height to be 1 inch. And it's not taking it. I'm telling you, sometimes this software can be so temperamental. So 1.0 inches. Okay, there we got it. And so I'm going to align that square to the top. And now I'm going to put my solid circle, and I'm going to position it about halfway on the bottom of that square. And now I no longer need the square. I was using that just where to position this circle. So I'm going to select them both, and I am going to align in the middle. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. I will align it center. Now I'm going to take this circle and I'm going to really zoom into this because I'm going to use my arrow keys to nudge it. And I want it on top, so I'm going to right click and I am going to bring it to the front. And so I want to center it over this circle. And I want it to be perfectly centered. And so I'm going to zoom in really close, just to make sure. And we need to bring it down a little bit. And that looks good. And so we will expand back out. Now I'm going to select all of them. I'm going to right click and I'm going to group them. Okay, and the last thing we need to do, let me ungroup this again, is we want that slot to be facing down. And so I am going to flip vertically. And then I also want to make sure that we're perfectly aligned. And by flipping it, we did adjust our alignment, so I need to get that back into place. And I want to make sure that we are centered horizontally. And once again, I want to make perfectly sure that we are perfectly aligned with our circles, and it looks like we are. And the reason I put the notch on the bottom is because we're going to want the notch in the rod that we're going to create in the 3D software to be facing the bottom. And so now I'm going to right click and I'm going to group them. And then we are going to save it to the hard drive. And I'm going to save it as wheelchair cup holder mounting bracket. It already exists, so I'm just going to replace it.